Hi guys. Today, special treat. We have Steven from Exponent.
Super excited to be on the show, Jeff. Big fan. Also, my name is Steven. I run Exponent. We have an awesome YouTube channel that you can check out where we do mock interviews. But we are a community of interview preppers. We believe that interviewing shouldn't be alone, and that's why we have a whole like tens of thousands of people in our community helping each other prepare for roles like program management, product marketing management, software engineering, and much more. You can check us out at tryexponent.com, and we have tons of courses, coaching, and everything like that. But super excited to be here on the show today, Jeff, and excited to provide some value to your viewers.
So, what are we going to do today? We are going to focus specifically on product management. This is an incredibly tricky space, and if anybody were to ask me today, 2020, September 2020, it's the hardest position out there to interview for. Tons of different types of questions. And as we've gone through this with our clients, we found it's really, really tricky. And so to have an expert like Steven, who we didn't get a chance to mention, but actually has a background in product management from Google, just super excited. So we're going to dive right in. And the first area we want to focus on is types of questions, right? People are diving on to Glassdoor. They're going and checking out your site. They're checking out questions and they're seeing a lot of them. So let's categorize them for them. Tell me, what are the most common questions that you think product managers are facing in these interviews, in these roles today?
Totally. And so we've seen a lot of growth in product management as a space and also product management interview questions over the past few years. So the types of questions have changed quite a bit, or they've been renamed or adapted from different companies. But generally, the way I think about the different types of questions that are the main ones that a product manager might face in an interview, on-site interview, would be an estimation question. You also have analytical questions. You have execution questions. You have product design / product sense questions. Even product strategy questions is now a new category that's being asked much more frequently. And then there's also always the technical questions that come up at some of the companies, depending on whether or not they're technical.
Okay. And you guys, this is why it's so crazy, because there's so many different types of questions. All right, let's start with maybe one that people in the product management space are really connected with, but there's tends to be just some fear and unknowns around the estimation question. So let's start there. Maybe high level, and we're going to go high level, everybody, through a few different strategies with Steven for tackling some of these types of questions. Let's start with estimation. Like, what do you think with estimation questions? What are a few keys to success to really crush those questions?
Yeah, so estimation questions always sound really scary. It's like, how many people watch an opera every year in the United States? It's like, how are you supposed to answer that? What is the actual secret of answering this question successfully is the actual answer doesn't matter. And what matters more is how you think about the problem and coming up with a structure and approach and breaking down that problem. Just as a product manager might do, you have to kind of break down problems into smaller components, solve those smaller components, and then pop them back up into the comprehensive kind of picture. And so, yeah, that's generally what we recommend for folks with estimation interview questions, is to really break down the problems into their subcomponents as much as possible. Now, for each of these questions, I want to leave you with something that makes you even better, take you from an A to an A+ answer. And so my little tip on estimation questions that bring you from an A to an A+ answer is mention edge cases. And what I mean by edge cases are, let's say the opera question that we mentioned, right? Maybe you might want to ask, like, is this year COVID? Is this 2020? Because that's going to look a lot different. Or, you might want to ask, like, okay, like, if we're looking for a certain time span, is it in the summer or the winter? Maybe those are very different depending on those different cases. Those little edge cases make you sound really smart because you're thinking about the problem, and they communicate to the interviewer that you're not just answering the question, but you're thinking outside of the box. You're thinking about all the other things. And that's, again, a super important skill as a product manager, because you need to always be thinking, like, how does that look in landscape mode? Or, like, how's this going to look in low bandwidth conditions, things like that. So yeah, that's my brief tip of thoughts on the estimation question.
Okay. I want two follow-up questions.
Yeah.
So two areas I see people struggling with really on these questions are the math component and the sanity check component. So maybe if you can just touch on both of those areas, maybe it's like the simplification of math or sanity checking your answer. Those are two areas that I highlight to clients. What do you think about those areas? Maybe tell me your thoughts.
Yeah. So first off, with the math stuff, generally you can round things, like is the big tip. Like you don't have to use the actual numbers, or and if you get messy numbers, just round things or make them kind of nice numbers. You're not here to get an exact answer. You're here to get an order of magnitude answer or something like that. So I'd recommend just simplifying the math where possible. Also, just coming in knowing a few facts just generally about size helps. So at Exponent in our course, we have like an estimation fact sheet. And so, you don't have to use ours, but just come in with a few sense of numbers, right? Like how many people are in the US? How many people are in the world? How many people are in one city? And then those little kind of benchmarks help you benchmark your answer throughout the interview question. So that kind of helps with the sanity check stuff. And really at the end, the sanity check is sort of like, okay, I came up with an answer. Is this good or not? Um, you can rely on some of those little techniques of knowing facts, knowing information. What's the average revenue of a company, for a tech company? Like what's the revenue numbers for some of these big tech companies? Things like that can really help benchmark things for you. But ultimately, again, it's not about getting the right answer. It's about justifying it. And so at the end, when you say the answer and you say, hey, actually, I don't know if this is right, just explain your reasoning. Like, why are you having that reaction? What are your thoughts? Like, you must have some kind of rationale for that. Maybe based on some other benchmarks, and communicating that effectively is the most important part.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, you guys, the one other thing I just want to throw in there, I don't know why this one always sticks with me, but let's say it's a cheeseburger question, right? If you end up saying at the end of your answer, the average American eats 50 cheeseburgers a week, just sanity check it. Do we really eat 50 cheeseburgers a week? I don't know why that always sticks in my head, but I love that one. Okay, now I want to talk about one that I think, let's talk about the product design. This is a big one. You guys, we could spend hours on this one alone. But just simplistically, when we're a product manager going into one of these interviews, especially at these premier companies, what are a few really key areas, Stephen, that candidates can focus on to have success with the design questions?
Totally. So for product design questions, they're very varied, but they all break down to sort of how would you design X? Like how would you redesign the airport? How would you redesign the library? And so for these questions, my general approach, and one just right off the bat, is not to overuse a framework. We see this all the time in interviewees, and it's really frustrating because it means the interviewee is not sort of thinking themselves or thinking creatively. So applying a framework is not a good answer because in your actual job as a product manager, you're never going to be applying a framework. You're always going to be evaluating different frameworks, kind of picking your own, but you're never going to be like, oh, this is exactly the technique, and therefore I'm going to do this, 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 this. Now, what I will say though is it helps to start with a user perspective. So when you answer these questions, think about the user, think about what their problems are, and kind of go from there. Instead of focusing on the solution immediately, you want to focus on first understanding the problem. And so that's the general approach that I take throughout that series of questions. Now, the tip that I have for this one, like the tip that will take your answer from an A to an A plus, is the vision. So, at some point in your answer, when you're brainstorming, you're coming up with stuff, what I want to hear is I want to hear you say, this is going to be the Uber for whatever, or this is going to be the blank for blank. And the cool thing about that is that one, it encapsulates your whole idea in one phrase. Two, it communicates it very effectively to the interviewer, so the interviewer can kind of grok or understand what's going on. And three, it's an opportunity to express your passion, which I think is really important in these interview questions. They want to see someone who likes brainstorming, who's creative, who's thoughtful, who's insightful. And it's a great way to kind of make it memorable and also show your passion for that particular topic that you're designing.
Okay, helpful. Let's talk about the framework for a second, because I think Stephen brings up a great point. With frameworks, you can go and Google McKinsey or Bain or BCG and have these very rigid frameworks. Frameworks should be, if you're going to come in and provide some higher level concepts of how you might think about design, just don't have the rigidity. Have some ideas in mind, but be flexible. I love that point, because you want to come in with an idea if you're going to design something, but you don't want to not be flexible too. Flexibility is huge.
Totally. Yeah. And it's pretty easy to tell if you're an interviewer, if the candidate is sort of stuck to an inflexible framework.
Yeah. And this, you guys, the other thing with this framework piece that I want you to think about is, how do we use similar concepts but use different words? That can switch it up a little bit too, but just no rigidity with the framework. Like, if you're going to present concepts, just have flexibility. It's super important. I want everybody to stay organized, but not organized to the point where, yeah, your interviewer is like, okay, they plan this, it's totally pre-planned, and they're not thinking and using their brain. Okay, let's talk product strategy. Okay, so this is obviously coming up a lot. It's coming up more and more where these companies want you to strategize. We're seeing it a lot at startups where they're really looking for people to bring some strong ideas. It happens at all companies. Let's talk through it. What are you seeing in the landscape in terms of these questions? What are maybe a couple strategies you might recommend, please?
Yep. So these are new type of questions that are being asked by companies. Google recently added it to its set of questions. And they really, what they involve is testing for product strategy knowledge. So do you know how to think about the business side of a company, you know, not just the product design experience? Because if you make an excellent product, it may not be effective if you don't have the right strategy. It's a really important part of product management. And there are actually, in fact, different roles at some companies like Facebook where you actually have a product strategist as a role, and they ask them these questions as well. So there's some variation there. For product strategy questions, really what I would recommend is understanding tech strategy broadly and bringing that into the conversation. And so strategy is most effective when, you know, think about business schools. How do they teach strategy? They teach it by doing case-based approaches, right? And so what you'll want to do is you want to read websites. Stratechery by Ben Thompson is a really awesome one that is worth reading. But there are other sites. You can just kind of Google company strategy blogs and things like that. Find awesome blogs that you think are really exciting or interesting. Read them, consume them, wrestle with them, have some opinions about them. You know, don't just take it for value's sake. And then weave that into your answers. So when you answer a question about what's the Google strategy, you can say, well, when Netflix did this thing, you know, this is what happened, and therefore I would take this approach. And so having that background knowledge is really, really helpful. And then my pro tip, my A to A plus tip on this one, watch a company keynote before you interview the company. So most companies have keynotes or some kind of presentation they give at some public forum. Even if it's an interview with the founder or the CEO, you can watch that. Having that knowledge going into the interview is like a secret weapon throughout all your interview questions, because you can actually answer and allude to the company strategy throughout the interview, which makes it really, really effective. And it also shows that you care or you're interested to work at that company.
Okay. You guys, amazing tips. I would have never thought of that. So I don't want to spend too much more time on questions. I guess the one other question, just a couple of high level tips, are these technical product management questions. And is there any way to like up your knowledge with those types of questions? Is this kind of stuff that you should already know? Like, how can you up your game when it comes to a technical product manager question?
Yeah, these are the most scary for most people. Some companies do not ask these. So like Facebook does not have technical questions, but Google does. Google does ask technical questions based on the candidate's experience. My general tip is, one, just be calm about it. You know, often technical questions boil down to other types of questions, right? It's like estimation questions. One question is like, how many megabytes does it take to store all of Google Photos for all users or something? While that may sound technical, and there are some technical elements that are helpful, it actually is fundamentally an estimation question with just missing pieces of information. And so you can still solve those problems if you don't have that information. I do think it's helpful to review some technical concepts, even just some basic things. You're rarely asked to code or anything like that, but you might be asked to understand, like how does a network work, or what could be causing a connectivity issue or something like that. And so understanding like, hey, how does the internet work? Like what happens when I type in www.google.com? Things like that are helpful. And so some of that like technical adjacent knowledge can be really, really helpful. And then, ultimately though, like what I would recommend is just kind of a calmness. And my A to A plus answer on this one is really just coming in and not focusing on the technical stuff. Going in there, hearing the technical stuff, writing down what you know, analyzing the problem as best as you can, and you're going to shine, even if you may not know that specific technical constraint, and you communicate that clearly to your interviewer.
Okay. Love that technical adjacent. Yeah, I think in a lot of roles, a basic understanding of how the internet works, how a data center works, just these like very fundamental technology pieces can be really helpful. Okay, let's focus a little bit on prep. Just high level, if you're going to prep for a product manager interview, big companies, startup, whatever it's going to be, what are maybe 2 or 3 recommendations or suggestions you have for prepping?
Yeah. So there's definitely a ton of resources now, which is really awesome. But I think, Jeff, you and I agree on this a lot, but practice would be the number one thing that I would recommend people. I wish people practice more than they did. And, one tip I have is to practice in front of a mirror or a webcam or something like that so you can see yourself or record yourself. Definitely practice as much as possible. So find a peer mock interview that you can do with someone. We have it in Exponent. We have like a whole platform where you can get peer mock interviews. Find videos of examples to look at. There's tons on YouTube now. Just Google PM interviews. You can see some on our channel too. Those kinds of things will help a lot to kind of ease the comfort level and things like that. There's actually a recent study that was done where they had 2 sets of candidates. One was software engineering, and one software engineering with an interviewer in the room, and one software engineering without an interviewer in the room. And the ones that performed worse were the ones with the interviewer in the room. And that just goes to show the anxiety, the imposter syndrome, like the stress about the interview are really, really important, almost as much as the actual content itself. And so, yeah, my tip for folks preparing is really to just get that practice in and get comfortable with the interview process.
Yeah, and you guys have just mention one other item. Look at the science behind interviewing. Our words don't mean nearly as much as our ability to have positive body language, smile, bring in all this stuff, and pause, build in space in our interviews. And I think, Steve and I can both talk about building in the space, going back and forth during the interview. Don't go on long tangents. It just doesn't work. But not to knock either of our businesses, but the reality is that our words are a small percentage. We want to get those words right, but it's all the other stuff that really, really matters. Okay, let's maybe just talk about, so we talked about the questions, we talked about the prep. Lastly, let's talk about just some general miscues besides not practicing, just maybe a couple of like, I love your 8A plus analogy. So just maybe like a couple of pro tips that you haven't already mentioned, or something that you're just kind of thinking through it and saying, we haven't talked about this, or, oh, we forgot to mention this. And it's a critical component for success. Anything else you think is important or you'd want to introduce?
Yeah. Well, there's so many things that I could mention. One of them that I feel really important about, I really feel like it's really important, is asking questions to your interviewer. And so that's something we don't really talk about often. And I actually don't really talk about that often on when I break down some of these problems. But you always have that little like 3 to 5 minute slot at the end to ask the interviewer questions. And if you think about it, this is actually the last time the interviewer has an impression of you. Even though I know, it's meant for you to get your questions answered. This is actually like an excellent time to show your thoughtfulness and your interest in the role and your passion for the role. And so I would actually go in there and have some questions that you think you're really genuinely interested in, but that you'd like to ask some of the people at the company. And so just make a personal list. Some that I like are things like, how do decisions get made at this company? Or, what, if you're actually trying to assess, what you want out of the company, which is definitely the part, interviewing is actually a two-way thing, right? Like you're not just being interviewed, you're also interviewing the company. You can ask, like, what are some of the hard parts of this company, or what are some decisions of the company you don't agree with? And things like that can be really, really helpful and thoughtful and show that you're really interested and engaged in the company. So yeah, my last tip is to make the whole interview an A to an A plus, like have some really great questions at the end that you're really interested in and passionate about.
Awesome. And I will double up on that, say it's incredibly important. You will actually never get a job if they ask you if you have any questions and you don't have any. It's actually a huge critical point where they're going to say, how could this person be interested in the job if they don't have any questions? And secondarily, it's okay to have written out questions and literally say, Sue, these are my questions. That's preparation. You've thought about the role beforehand. That's totally cool. Stephen, thank you so much for taking the time. Guys, I'm going to put all this information in the YouTube description below. The website, tryexponent.com, the YouTube channel, Exponent. Awesome resource. Just so psyched. Thank you so much, Stephen. It's great chatting with you.
Thanks for having me on the show, Jeff.
Awesome.